Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining, particularly after the England game last night. I'm sure there's a few people on the call who are slightly sleep deprived or possibly hungover, but I won't comment on that. Before we get started, I will be taking questions, so there should be a Q&A tab, so please put your questions in there. I'll get to as many as I can. If they're quite detailed and specific questions that I couldn't answer in this session or couldn't answer in full in this session, then I will happily respond following this session. And if I don't answer everyone's questions, that's because I probably covered it in another question. So thank you to K3 for having me, and thank you to everyone for carving out the time on a working day to listen to me talk about hackers. And before we start, I just want to get people thinking about something. And there's a question I want you to sit with for the next half an hour. And the question is, do you actually know what an attacker wants from your business? Not in a vague, it's all a bit scary way, but specifically if a criminal, cyber criminal, woke up this morning and decided that your company was the target, what exactly would they come for? What would they be trying to steal or disrupt? And would you notice that they were disrupting you or taking it? So just have a think about that. In my experience, many leadership teams can't answer that question. They worry about cybersecurity in general terms and they spend money on it in general terms. And as a result, they will protect everything a little and not protect the important things nearly enough. And this afternoon, I want to flip that around and I want to talk about your crown jewels within the business. And these are the handful of assets that, if you lost them, would genuinely threaten the business. And if you can find those, protect those, prioritize those, then you've done half the job or more. Quick word on me, who's taking up your afternoon, and you can judge whether I'm worth the time. I spent 9 years in the army, multiple tours of Iraq and Afghanistan. I worked at NATO for a period of time. And when I left in 2011, I could see when I was in Kabul that the world was changing. The sort of warfare was not just on the battlefield. There was a lot of digital stuff going on. Cybersecurity was becoming much more important. And I realized that that was where warfare was going. It was moving away from the traditional battlefield. And I moved into cybersecurity on the theory that crisis management, which I have a strong background is crisis management, whether you're working within a traditional military background or within cybersecurity. Since then, I was at KPMG. I also helped grow a cyber consultancy from nothing to over 70 people and expand internationally. I've run two cyber businesses as chief executive and chief operating officer. And at the moment, I am advising through my own firm. And I also wrote a book about all of this called Cybersecurity for Business Leaders, which came out in May. And my publisher said that I need to call it a bestseller. So I guess it's a bestseller. Okay, so let me show you first who the type of people are that want a piece of you and your company, what they're actually after, and then what you can do about it. I can get the slides to work, which is always the problem. Okay, so picture the scene in Jurassic Park. I'm sure many of you can remember where the velociraptors learn how to open doors, and the gamekeeper, who's played by a British actor called Bob Peck, uses the word "clever girls," and that is a rough analogy on where cybercrime sits in 2026. 10 years ago, the cartoon version was of a bored hacker, a bored teenager, sorry, who was a hacker sitting in a dark bedroom in a hoodie. And this really hasn't been true for a long, long time. The modern threat is run by professionals with salaries, performance reviews, training, and in some cases, government pensions. That's not an exaggeration. that is actually happening. That's the reality. And there are broadly 5 types of person who might come for you, and it helps to know which is which, and also what your business does, because some of the hackers will be more interested in different types of business than others. But it's just well worth thinking that through. Firstly, we've got nation states, so Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Effectively, unlimited time, budget, and deniability. Russia has APT 28 and 29, which sound like Cold War spy novels. China has PLA Unit 61398, and North Korea has a crew called the Lazarus Group, which sounds like a death metal band, but is a serious criminal operation. The Lazarus Group funded a good chunk of the North Korea's missile program by stealing cryptocurrency. These aren't teenagers. They are highly educated. They've got advanced degrees, official job titles that should read international cybercriminal, but do not. What they're doing is they are looking to steal intellectual property. They'll be carrying out cybersecurity reconnaissance on critical national infrastructure, and also in North Korea's case, trying to steal money. And if your business is involved in defence, critical national infrastructure, finance, then you can expect some of these cyber criminals to take an interest. Organised crime. So this is where blue collar has gone white collar. There's outfits like Lockbit and Conti. They generate hundreds of millions in revenue. They have HR functions. They have customer service desks for victims. They're parasites on the whole, and they make a lot of money. A big innovation in cybersecurity over the last few years is ransomware as a service, where one gang builds a kit, another rents it, points it at a target, and they split the takings. And they have democratized a lot of the cybersecurity attacks, whereby some of the hackers don't even need a huge amount of skill because they can buy a lot of the stuff they need from these groups. And they're extremely sophisticated. They will be looking primarily to steal money, looking to steal data to sell for money, and they will go for low-hanging fruit. So they will go for companies that are easy targets. You've then got insiders. So these are people that are either suppliers or employees. You probably know them. Sometimes they can be malicious, they can be disgruntled employees, or sometimes just careless. Never underestimate an annoyed employee with a USB stick and a grievance. Just a question, where are the slides? So I should be sharing the slides. Hopefully someone from the technical team will jump in. If not, we will share the slides as a PDF in the chat, so you'll have the slides afterwards. Moving on, so hacktivists and chancers. So these are ideologically motivated. They're a nuisance. They may be opportunist, less existential, but can be capable of causing a fair amount of damage. If you're a defense supplier supplying to the likes of Israel, you might be a target. If you're in the oil industry or if you're doing animal testing, essentially, if you're a company where someone with an ideological grievance around what your company does, you could certainly be a target to hacktivists and chancers. And the thing that should really focus the mind of people is how do they get in? And it's often not through some Hollywood type scene where you've got a lot of hackers sat in a room trying to crack a code. They simply send an email. That is often enough. Phishing is still the most common attack vector by distance. Someone in finance clicks a link. It looks like it came from a supplier, or someone phones the IT desk pretending to be a new starter who has lost their password. It's old-fashioned con artistry done at scale. But the important thing to just note is that they will have done their homework. They do the reconnaissance of the company, and they will look for the weak links before they're doing any attacks. Once they're inside, they're often patient. The technical term is advanced persistent threat. The image I often conjure up is if you imagine a burglar quietly moving into your loft for 6 months, they sit there cataloging everything you own, occasionally moving things around to unsettle you, and then they wait for the perfect moment to clean you out, probably when you're on holiday. Yeah, that's a pretty good image for how the hackers operate. Okay, so what are your crown jewels? I mentioned this at the beginning. So this is the real question, and this is where if you're starting to think about cybersecurity for your company, if you want to take more of an interest, you want to speak to your technical teams to start to understand how well protected you are, this is a good place to start. And an attacker is interested in what your assets are clearly as a business. They're not worried about your mission statement or your brand values. They're after whatever they can sell, what they can ransom or what they can weaponize. So that could be money. So they will be interested in your payment processes and systems. If you hold sensitive data, they'll be interested in stealing that, particularly if it's personal data or medical data. If it's some of the state-sponsored hackers, they'll be interested in IP, particularly some of the Chinese organizations. They're interested in trying to shortcut the development of some of their own technology. So your job as a leader is to see your own organization through their eyes and try and work out what they would reach for first. And I call these the crown jewels. So every business has them, and they're very rarely what the IT inventory says. And they tend to fall into four buckets, as I've already touched on. You've got data, so customer records, payment details, health information, anything that's covered by a regulator. It's a classic target because it has resale value, and losing it triggers fines and headlines. If you hold personal data, that is certainly a crown jewel, whether you think of it that way or not. Systems and operations. So these are the parts of the business that you have to keep running to make money. So if you think about your business, what are the systems, what are the operations, what are the processes that if they went down would seriously damage your business's future and ability to run it? These could be booking systems, the production line, payment terminals, and ransomware crews love this because they can stop you trading and you'll feel the pain immediately and you'll be very tempted to pay the ransom to make it stop. Intellectual property, as I've mentioned, so designs, formulas, source code, pricing, contract pipeline, the quiet stuff that is behind many businesses. Nation states, as I mentioned, play a long game here. They're not after a quick ransom. They want to find and steal what makes you special so that another competitor in their country no longer has to invent it. And then the people and access. So your senior team will often be a target. That's where the hackers will identify who the senior people are. They will target them. They will build up profiles using social media and their profiles online. The finance staff in particular, if you're a business like most businesses making a lot of payments, hackers will want to try and see what's going on and potentially insert themselves into that payment process. There's a number of years ago, we were getting calls almost weekly from companies where they'd been defrauded because a hacker had essentially doctored an invoice and the company had made that payment to the hacker rather than one of their suppliers. And the thing that's interesting there is that's not just cybersecurity. That's about having the right processes in place that support good security. So are you verifying new payment details? Are you phoning up the switchboard to verify those? If you get a payment request from one of the senior team, are you actually verifying that that senior person asked you to make the payment? So that's just worth mentioning. The other attractive target for hackers is anyone who has any kind of administrator access into a company's network. Because if you've got administrators access, and this is primarily your IT team, although in a number of companies there are more administrators than would be recommended. Attackers then can get into the systems and actually start moving things around. So they've got the keys to the system. So a simple exercise you can run with your board or your exec or your senior leadership team, and it takes about an hour. You don't need to bring any external consultants in to do it, but just ask three questions and have someone taking notes, minute the meeting, and really agree among you what the answers to these questions are. And the first one is, what would hurt most if we lost it for a week? If a competitor saw it or it appeared on the front page of a newspaper, that will give you a pretty good idea on what your crown jewels are. Where is that asset? Where does it live? How's it protected? Who can touch it? Who has access to it? Then what would it cost us in cash and trust if it were gone, if we were to lose access to it? And then very quickly, that will narrow your focus onto where your crown jewels are. And in many cases, that will probably be an uncomfortable conversation because you'll realize that you're probably or potentially falling into the category of protecting a lot of things rather than focusing on the crown jewels. Two traps to avoid. The first is assuming that your crown jewels sit in some obvious vault. Often they'll be scattered around an organization. There'll be spreadsheets, a shared drive that perhaps nobody actually owns, a former employee's account that was never switched off. So understanding who has access to the crown jewels and building a picture and cataloging what they are is really important. And then the second thing is to thinking just about confidentiality. For a lot of business, the difficulty is not just the data being stolen, it's the operations being stopped. And availability is a crown jewel too. And the Jaguar Land Rover case, which I'll come on to in a second, is a real example of what can go, what it could look like when you lose access and you lose availability. If you get this part right, then everything else becomes a lot easier. You can make sure that your budget is focused on protecting the crown jewels rather than trying to protect everything. And you can put some real protection in place around the few things that actually matter. And this will make a lot of particularly senior people feel a lot more reassured. Okay, so what does this look like for British business? Well, there were last year, I think pretty sure it was last year, there were two major attacks on British business. The end of August, Jaguar Land Rover was hit by a ransomware attack. The group who attacked it called itself Scattered Lapsus Hunters. JLR shut down production in Solihull, Wolverhampton, Halewood, and they stayed shut for 5 weeks. And although there's a lot of figures bandied around, the sort of recognised figure that it cost them was in the region of £196 million in a single quarter. And apparently the wider hit to the UK economy was about £1.9 billion. And it's believed to be the most economically damaging cyber event in British history. And the Bank of England name-checked it when they trimmed their own growth forecast. So it actually affects UK GDP. And the thing that I think is really thought-provoking for this webinar is it's not just JLR that were affected, but they have a whole supply chain ecosystem that surrounds them. And some of those businesses are probably quite small, and those businesses were affected. So the net effect on the UK economy was not just the attack on Jaguar Land Rover, but actually the supply chain as well. So a good exercise to do is to think many companies will have that anchor client, the big client that takes up anything from 25% or maybe 30% of the revenue is quite common. Think about what would happen if that business was hacked. Would that dramatically, and I suggest the answer is yes, cause issues for our business? And that's not a cybersecurity exercise, that's a pure risk management exercise. We go back to Easter, there was a group called Scattered Spider, similar family of criminals. They rang the M&S Marks and Spencer's IT help desk, pretending to be staff who had lost access, and they got passwords reset and they were in. They then encrypted the systems. Marks and Spencer's could not take contactless payments. I'm sure there were a lot of people up in arms in places like Chelsea, Richmond, etc., because they couldn't get their Marks and Spencer's food on the way home. And if you remember, you couldn't buy food from Marks and Spencer's for quite a while. And click and collect went down. The clothing store was offline for over a month. And the final bill was about 300 million in lost operating profit, and a heavy hit to the share price. Co-op was struck in the same week, with empty shelves and membership data compromised, and Harrods had to restrict internet access. And just notice, as I mentioned, the method there was not some exotic exploit, but simply a phone call and someone wanting to be helpful. And then the crown jewels were essentially accessed. So, it's just worth bearing in mind. And I mentioned the supply chain point. So when a big customer hits, Marks and Spencer's would clearly have a lot of suppliers. So it wasn't just the Jaguar Land Rover suppliers, Marks and Spencer suppliers, co-op suppliers. That can cause a real issue for a lot of smaller businesses. Just want to take a slight step back to just talk about the sort of wider geopolitical stuff going on, because it is relevant. Firstly, 99% of international data, so bank transfers, video calls, your Netflix subscription, the UK's trade with the EU, travels through subsea fibre optic cables, and there's about 60 of them that land on the British coastline, with concentrations in East Anglia and the southwest. And in plain English, they are the central nervous system of the country and the economy, if you like. In April this year, the former Defence Secretary John Healey stood up in Downing Street and confirmed something that the Ministry of Defence had been declining for a while, that the Royal Navy has been working tracking Russian submarines that were loitering around our undersea cables. One was an attack submarine and two were specialist deep sea research vessels. And it's pretty obvious what they were doing. They were carrying out reconnaissance onto the UK infrastructure, and they're carrying out reconnaissance for sabotage. And the clear reason why is because there's a war in Ukraine. The UK is providing material to Ukraine. They're providing support to Ukraine. They're training the Ukrainian army. And we are an enemy of Russia. With the war, the US bombing in Iran, there are Iranian intelligence agents operating around London, and they are not only trying to steal secrets, but they're looking at how could they disrupt the UK economy. So the whole cybersecurity threat happening in the UK at the moment is not just down to stealing money. There is a wider geopolitical element as well. There's another part of the story in that there's the foreign information and manipulation. So if you think about a lot of the really sort of inflammatory issues that are prevalent at the moment, and you only have to go on Twitter to just see the arguments about Israel, Gaza, trans rights, the war in Ukraine. And a lot of this is stoked up by countries like Russia, who set up fake news sites to look like European newspapers. They game the algorithms, and what they're trying to do is to get the population getting angry about it, and they're doing a pretty good job. One specific target they go after are the universities, partly because they conduct sensitive research and have government contracts, but also their cybersecurity is generally poor. They have low budgets. It's difficult to recruit people. But also, if you can cause a conversation on campus, which has happened for tens of years. Divisive issues will get discussed at universities. You can shift the conversation to Westminster, and a lot of the Gaza protests, the gender politics, a lot of that is inflamed by Russian hacking groups and hostile state actors who have realised that it's a good way to manipulate and get the story onto the front page of the newspapers. And I've spoken about this on a number of forums, and some people think it's a bit conspiracy theory-esque, but having spoken to a number of intelligence people about this, I can assure you this is absolutely happening. And you only have to start reading some of the reports about potential manipulation of elections in the US and the Brexit vote to realise that this is actually real. Right. Okay, so what can you actually do about it? Well, there's three things to take away, and these are the things that I would, if I were a business owner or a senior leader, and I wanted to really dig into the cybersecurity within my company, these are the things that I would look at. And I've spent a decade sitting in with exec teams and boardrooms, watching super capable people, people who can dissect a P&L without breaking a sweat, go silent the minute that security starts getting talked about. And that's not because they weren't clever. It's because often there is a gap between technical people, cybersecurity people, and commercial business people. And that gap is improving, but I think it can still be improved more. So the first thing is that cybersecurity is a leadership problem. It's not a technology problem. The leadership need to really understand what the problem is, and they will need to, as I say, look at the crown jewels, decide what the crown jewels are, work with their security team to do that, and then decide the level of risk that you're willing to carry. If you're a high growth startup that has just raised some money and the main thing affecting the future of your business is getting your product out to the market, you'll have a very different risk profile to someone like Jaguar Land Rover or Goldman Sachs, where actually it's about protecting your operations, your crown jewels, your IP, etc., etc. And that's an exec decision, not an IT decision. So leadership really needs to take ownership of this and work with their IT, their cybersecurity people to really agree what the crown jewels are and the level of risk that they need to undertake. The second thing is the basics will be any shiny piece of software every day of the week. So that's just doing really boring things, doing it well, putting processes in place, auditing that it's happening, and building it into the business as usual part of the business. So that's multi-factor authentication, whether it's using sort of mobile phones or facial recognition for your laptops, whatever it is. Having your laptops encrypted, particularly in London, where a lot of people bring their laptops to work, and some of the nefarious characters I mentioned will hang around bars trying to steal laptops. Have backups, make sure they're tested and kept offline. I could fill an entire presentation about backups. It's quite complicated, but having some kind of process around backups and testing that you can bring them online. Patching, which is when you have an iOS update on your iPhone, or if you need to update the software on your Samsung phone or whatever, that is essentially patching the weaknesses in the software. And hackers will know very quickly where the weaknesses are. So patching and having a process to do that, particularly if you've got hundreds of pieces of software that needs to be patched every month, that can be quite a large exercise. So putting processes in around that. Training your people to spot a dodgy email, challenge odd phone calls. And by training, I don't just mean people watching the mandatory security awareness videos, doing proper training, using multi-channels to keep people aware, posters, screenshots, more interactive training, using your cybersecurity or IT people to train experts or create subject matter experts within each team who then flow that cybersecurity best practice down. It takes time and it's a constant battle to do, but training is super important, doing the right training. But none of these are complicated. They're not particularly fashionable, but they will make a huge difference to your cybersecurity, because most successful breaches will essentially exploit a basic failure in your cyber hygiene, not some exotic program or piece of code. So focus on the basics first before you start spending anything with AI in the title, is my recommendation. And then the last thing is plan for the day that it happens, because it probably will. And you can bridge the gap between a recoverable incident and an existential threat to the business entirely through rehearsing and everyone knowing what they need to do. So if you haven't done one before, run a tabletop exercise with your executive team. Run through exactly who does what if you're attacked, who's in the room, how do you know how serious the breach is? And it's easier to overreact to a breach than it is to underreact. You can always overreact and then scale down. Who do you call? Which clients do you speak to? Do you need to speak to your bank because you may not be able to operate and you may need cash? Print out your incident response plan and keep a paper copy, because the hackers may well encrypt a digital one. Walk it through your exec team. Do it super slowly to start with. And as you get better and better at it, maybe run through some more realistic incidents. Bring some people in, potentially involve actors playing press, depending on what your business is. It won't be fun. People will probably mess up and make fools of themselves. But the one thing that the military is very good at is doing the basics well and rehearsing. And you very much take the kind of walk, run approach. And a lot of the things that you need to do will come out of that exercise, and just doing the exercise will build resilience into your business. And you'll notice that none of those three things were about computers. They're about ownership, discipline, rehearsals, and leadership. And they're all things that the majority of this audience will be very good at in the parts of the business that they work in. So you do not need to become a cyber expert. You just need to become an expert at understanding what levels of cybersecurity you need for your business. I mentioned earlier that I wrote a book about this. So I wrote this so when I got into cybersecurity, I didn't have a technical or cybersecurity background. So I made a lot of notes as I was setting up the business with my colleagues. I worked with some extremely capable cybersecurity people who taught me a lot. And I just made notes and notes and notes over a number of years. And that seemed like a good idea for the book. And what the book is not a technical manual. It's a book written for a non-technical executive or business leader, middle manager, board member, non-exec, where it essentially runs you through in longer form what I've been through today. And the aim of that is not to teach everyone to become cybersecurity experts. It's to teach them enough to know which questions to ask and to ask the right questions. And the industry quietly profits from keeping that gap open. And the book is aimed at trying to narrow that gap. And I was extremely lucky to have a former head of MI6, Sir Richard Dearlove, who ran MI6 from 1999 to 2004, to write the foreword. So yeah, if I'm sure we can share the link if people want to pick up a copy. Okay, so we're almost at the end, so I'll just sort of summarize briefly, and I can see there's a couple of questions which I'll run through. So to just pull it together, cybersecurity is not optional. It's not bury your head in the sand and hope it doesn't happen. If you're in place, hope it happens on someone else's watch. It's not technical. It's very much, if you're on a leadership problem, it very much sits on your desk. If you are breached, you're the person who will have to speak to the Information Commissioner's office, the regulator. You'll have to speak to the client, speak to the bank, speak to your investors, potentially speak publicly if it's a major breach. So yeah, that is very much across a leader's desk. So it's just important to remember that. The people coming for you are professional, they're patient and well-resourced. And the defense is mostly about knowing what matters most. And I understand that people don't have infinite budgets. So it's about allocating as much of the budget as possible to protect those things that are important. So find the crown jewels, guard them, practice losing them, do the three things that I mentioned, and you'll be ahead of many organizations, many times your size. Thank you for spending the time to listen to me today. I believe the slides have been shared within the chat, so you'll be able to download those slides. And I'll now just look at the Q&A and run through a couple of questions. Okay, so question we've got here. So you talked about crown jewels. For a leadership team that's never done this, where do you actually start on a Monday morning? So, well, it's Monday today, so maybe start Tuesday or next week. But I kind of touched on this already. So start with a conversation, pull in your key people. So that'd be your finance director, your chief commercial officer or head of sales, whoever's responsible for IT. Bring in your leadership team, and there may be some others you need to widen the team for this, widen the conversation for this. And if you have a cybersecurity function, clearly bring them in because they'll be able to help with a lot of the education and color around this. And as I said, you ask three plain questions. So what would hurt us most if we lost it for a week, or if a competitor saw it, or it landed on the front page? So where does that thing live, and who can get at it? Who gets access to it? What would it cost us in terms of cash, customer trust, if we lost access to it or it vanished? And you should end up with a fairly short list, and this is your starting point. I said include IT, but don't delegate to them. Don't try and wait for the perfect methodology. The crown jewels you could probably thrash out in about an hour. And that's where you need to point your budget. Okay, what have we got here? If we have a limited budget and can only do three things this year, what should they be? Good question. And this is a good question because it's often cheaper than people expect. First one, turn on multi-factor authentication everywhere, starting with email, anything financial. It's close to free. If you're on Microsoft, you'll get it included. And that will shut down a huge share of the attacks on its own. Second one, understand your backups. What's your process around backups? Do you take them? How often do you take them? Do you keep a copy offline? Have you tested that you can restore them? Because if you haven't tested, how do you know you can bring them back up? It's important to remember that backups need to be shared on a completely separate network, because if your network gets breached, then the backups will get breached. Often that hasn't been taken into account. And then the third thing is rehearse for that bad day. Have a short session with your staff on spotting the dodgy emails and the phone calls. have a tabletop exercise at least once a year for your leadership team. You don't need to spend a lot of money on that, and you don't need a computer science degree. It just simply means building it into how does your business how your business typically operates. Um, Another couple of questions. So just sort of coming up to 45 minutes, keen to try and get this finished within 45 minutes. Is cyber insurance worth it? Yes, it is, but read the T's and C's. So what insurance companies have been very smart about doing is putting T's and C's in your policies that will exclude certain attacks. So many policies will not pay for state attributed attacks, social engineering, or if you haven't put some of the basics in place. So it's very important that as you're negotiating with your broker, you understand that and you negotiate around the T's and C's. And then when you're signing up for the policy, make sure that if you are audited, you can categorically state that you're adhering to the T's and C's. Um, One last question, and I think we'll end there. How do I know my IT provider is doing what they claim? Good question. So, I mean, the simple answer is ask for evidence. So, not just, oh, yeah, everything is fine. And often companies, particularly if they're small, will have outsourced IT who will look at their cybersecurity. So, ask them to show me, give me some kind of assurance around what you're doing at cybersecurity. So show me your patching reports, show me your backup tests. Are you providing training for the staff? Are you doing any kind of testing on my network? Are you monitoring my network? Get them to show you the results. And I appreciate that not everyone is a technical expert. So if necessary, get a third party to to provide some kind of subject matter expertise. It might only be half a day or a day of some person's time. A lot of what I do is doing that for companies, and I've got a lot of former colleagues who are doing that as well. And it's a half a day of someone's time. It's not that expensive, and when you compare it to what the cost of a breach might be, it's a drop in the ocean compared to a business shutting down for several weeks. Or in some cases, businesses have actually gone bust because of cybersecurity attacks. Okay, so yeah, so I think we're done with the questions, and I can see the slides have been shared, and I just want to say again, thank you for everyone for joining, particularly well done to everyone who stayed up to watch the game, potentially in a pub. If you made the webinar, I take my hat off to you. If you want to know more, contact details will clearly be shared after this. And I'm afraid, hopefully K3 aren't kicking me over the internet. You can buy my book on Amazon. The names in one of the last slides, and I've been told it's quite a funny read. So yeah, if you want to learn more, pick up the book. But if you've got any more detailed questions, feel free to send it to the K3 team, and we'll happily get back to you. And if necessary, happy to jump on a call and talk through anything specific. So I'll leave that there. Thanks all for joining. There will be other webinars throughout the year, and look forward to speaking to everyone again. Goodbye.